I wasn't desperate enough to admit it out loud, but I was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, the kind of tired that comes from watching your life stall while bills keep moving forward. And when the job listing appeared on my phone late one afternoon, it felt less like opportunity and more like something that had been waiting for me specifically, sitting there between delivery gigs and warehouse shifts, simple words glowing on the screen like they already knew my name. Night caretaker needed. Immediate start. Good pay. No experience required. I remember laughing under my breath at that, because nothing that pays well and asks for nothing ever ends well, right? Still, curiosity has a way of sounding like logic when you need money badly enough, so I tapped the listing, sent a short message, and before I could even lock my phone, it rang, not buzzed. Rang, sharp and sudden, making my chest jump like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. The voice on the other end was deep, rough around the edges, like gravel dragged slowly across stone, and warm in a way that felt practiced, almost rehearsed, introducing himself as Mr. Graydon, caretaker supervisor, though the way he said caretaker made it sound heavier, older, like a title that had existed long before job boards and emails ever did. He told me he'd been hoping I'd apply. Actually said that, as if he'd been waiting, and before I could ask how he even knew who I was, he added that the position needed to be filled tonight. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. His voice dropping into something quieter, something private, as if the call itself wasn't meant to be overheard. I checked the time, just after 5, daylight already thinning, and asked if that wasn't a bit rushed, trying to sound casual even though my pulse had picked up. And he chuckled softly, not amused, more relieved, saying some jobs couldn't afford delays, that certain places didn't like being left alone after dark, and that he had a feeling about me, the kind you learn to trust after many years. That should have been the moment I hung up, but instead I heard myself agreeing, because the pay he mentioned made my throat go dry, because he spoke with such certainty, and because a strange warmth crept in beneath my ribs, like being chosen for something I didn't understand yet. He told me where to meet him, a cemetery on the edge of town, old enough to have forgotten its own beginning, and said he'd be waiting by the office gate at dusk, then ended the call without saying goodbye. An hour later, I was driving under a sky bruised purple and blue, clouds stretched thin like old scars, the road narrowing as streetlights thinned out, my headlights catching rusted fencing and leaning stones long before I reached the entrance. The cemetery looked older than the map suggested, older than the town itself, its iron gates breathing softly as the wind pushed them open with a tired metallic sigh, as if even the metal was exhausted. I parked and stepped out, the air immediately colder than it should have been, carrying a smell like wet earth and something faintly bitter underneath it. And that's when I saw him. Mr. Graydon stood near a small office by the gate, posture straight, hands folded behind his back, as if he'd been standing there a long time already, waiting for me specifically. Up close, he looked older than I expected. Late 60s, maybe? Hair thin and slicked back, skin weathered like leather left too long in the sun. But his eyes were sharp, alert, alive in a way that didn't match the rest of him, tracking every movement I made like I was something that might bolt. He smiled when he saw me, a quick thing, polite but tight, and shook my hand with a grip that made my fingers ache. He said my name like he'd practiced it, like it meant something. He said he wouldn't keep me long, that nights here had a rhythm and I'd need to learn it quickly. Then he handed me 3 things: a ring of heavy keys, a flashlight that felt warmer than it should have been, and a thick, worn notebook bound in cracked leather. The notebook weighed more than it looked. Not physically, exactly, but in that strange way objects sometimes do when they carry history, when they've been held too often by too many nervous hands. I laughed a little, trying to break the tension, asked if this was some kind of orientation packet, and he watched me carefully before answering, saying softly that it was more of a survival guide. That made my laugh die halfway out of my throat. Inside the office, the air smelled like dust, ink, and something faintly medicinal. Shelves lined with old folders and chipped mugs, a single lamp buzzing quietly like it was struggling to stay awake. Mr. Graydon explained the basics in a calm, methodical voice. Lock the gate, make rounds, keep notes. Ordinary words that didn't quite fit the way his eyes kept darting toward the window as if listening for something outside. Then he tapped the notebook once with his finger and said this part mattered more than anything else. Inside were rules, not guidelines, not suggestions, rules. He said that word the way people say prayers, slow and careful, and when I jokingly asked if this was some kind of initiation prank, his face went very still, all warmth draining out of it in an instant, replaced by something hard and old and tired. He told me the place changed at night, that it had its own habits, its own expectations, and that people who ignored them tended not to last. The way he said last made my stomach tighten. He told me to read the rules slowly, to follow them exactly, and never to assume I understood them better than the place itself. Then, just like that, he checked his watch, said he had somewhere else to be before full dark, and added, almost as an afterthought, that he'd return at dawn if everything went well. If, the word echoed louder than it should have. When he left, the silence rushed in to replace him, thick and heavy, settling into the corners of the office like dust that had been waiting to fall. The wind sighed through the trees outside, carrying faint rustling sounds that didn't quite line up with its direction, and for a moment I just stood there, keys cold in my palm, heart beating a little too fast, wondering why I hadn't walked away when I still could. Eventually, I sat, opened the notebook, and turned to the first page. The handwriting was neat but uneven, like it had been written by different people over time, some lines darker, some faded, some pressed so hard the paper almost tore. The title read simply, Rules for the Night. I felt a strange, humorless smile tug at my mouth. Ha, because of course it did. Of course it had rules. As I started reading, a tightness formed behind my eyes. Not fear exactly, not yet, more like the uncomfortable awareness of being watched by something patient. The first few rules were strange but oddly specific. Locking gates even if someone knocked, making regular rounds, marking disturbances, ignoring certain sounds, avoiding certain places at certain times. Each line seemed harmless on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made my skin prickle, like a map of dangers that weren't supposed to exist. I told myself it was just atmosphere, just an old caretaker trying to scare off careless employees. But even as I thought it, the air in the room felt heavier, pressing softly against my chest, and I realized the sun had fully set without me noticing. I slipped the notebook into my jacket, stood up, and stepped outside to begin my first round, telling myself movement would help, that walking would burn off the nerves. The cemetery stretched farther than I'd expected, rows and rows of stones fading into shadow, some upright and proud, others sinking crookedly into the earth as if trying to crawl back down. Trees loomed overhead, their branches tangling together like knotted fingers, whispering softly when the wind passed through. My flashlight beam cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, and everywhere it landed, names surfaced briefly before disappearing again, lives reduced to stone and moss. The quiet felt wrong, not peaceful, not empty, but attentive, like the pause in a room when a conversation stops because someone new has entered. I checked my watch, noted the time, just like the rules said, and kept walking, telling myself this was just a job, just a night, just a story I'd laugh about later. Still, with every step, a strange feeling followed me, the unsettling sense that something had already noticed me, that the cemetery had shifted slightly the moment I agreed to stay, and that whatever rules waited deeper in that notebook weren't there to protect me from the place at all, but to protect the place from me. The first round passed slowly, each step crunching too loud against the gravel, every breath sounding like it didn't quite belong to me anymore. I kept telling myself this was normal, that cemeteries were supposed to feel heavy at night, that silence always feels louder when you're alone with your thoughts. But the deeper I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, clinging to my skin as if reluctant to let me pass. My flashlight beam jittered slightly in my hand, not from fear, I told myself, just nerves, just caffeine wearing off. Yet every time the light brushed over a headstone, it felt like interrupting something private. Names stared back at me, dates stretched across centuries, and some stones were so worn they looked more like scars in the ground than markers. I finished my first circuit and checked my watch, relieved to see time moving normally, then started again, because the notebook said hourly rounds mattered, said consistency mattered, said the cemetery noticed. That sentence stuck with me more than the rest. The cemetery notices. Halfway through the second round, the wind died so suddenly it felt like someone had closed a door on the world. The trees froze mid-sway, leaves suspended in an unnatural stillness, and the quiet that followed wasn't peaceful at all. It was thick and listening, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring just to prove you're still alive. My footsteps sounded too loud, too close, and that's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound behind me, not loud enough to echo, not heavy enough to be footsteps, but deliberate, paced, following. Tap, tap, tap. My shoulders tightened instantly, heart thudding hard against my ribs as Rule 3 surfaced in my mind like a warning flare. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. I felt a stupid, hysterical smile twitch at my mouth because, of course that would happen on the first night. I kept walking, eyes forward, pretending the sound didn't exist, even as it drew closer, matching my pace perfectly. My breath came shallow, my spine prickled with the urge to look, to confirm what my imagination was already painting, but I forced myself not to, repeating in my head that this was just sound, just air, just my brain misfiring. The tapping followed me for what felt like forever. Then, without warning, it stopped. Not faded, stopped. The absence of it felt louder than the sound itself, like something had leaned in close and then decided I wasn't worth the effort yet. I didn't stop walking until my legs started to shake, and when I finally dared glance at my watch, I realized only a few minutes had passed, though it felt like hours had peeled off my life. I reached an older section of the grounds where the stones leaned together like tired shoulders, their inscriptions blurred into pale ghosts of letters. As my flashlight swept across one particularly cracked marker, the beam flickered hard, sputtering like it was choking. My stomach dropped. I remembered the rule before my mind even finished forming the thought. If the light flickers in front of a grave, mark it. That's all it said. No explanation, no warning, just mark it. I swallowed and crouched, heart pounding, flipping open the notebook with fingers that suddenly didn't feel like mine. I scribbled a mark beside the corresponding time, my handwriting crooked and rushed, and the moment the pen left the page, the flashlight steadied, its beam returning to normal like nothing had happened. A laugh escaped me, thin and shaky, half relief, half disbelief, because the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. That was when it started to sink in that the rules weren't superstition, they were responses, instructions written by people who had already learned what happened when you didn't listen. By the time midnight crept up, the cemetery felt different again, heavier somehow, as if the darkness had gained weight. The large oak stood at the center of the grounds like a monument to something ancient and stubborn, its branches twisting outward in shapes that made my neck itch when I looked at them too long. I stood at a distance, turning the small stone over in my palm, suddenly aware of how loud my breathing sounded in the still air. The rule echoed in my head. Place the stone, do not look up. Simple. Easy. Ridiculous. My feet carried me forward anyway, each step slower than the last, the ground beneath the tree cooler, almost damp like it hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time. As I crouched and set the stone down, a pressure settled over me. Not physical exactly, more like being observed by something vast and patient. The branches above creaked softly, and my eyes burned with the urge to look, curiosity screaming that just one glance wouldn't hurt, that maybe this was all theater, some elaborate psychological test. but fear wrapped tight around my chest and held me still. I focused on the dirt, on the small imperfections in the stone, on anything except the space above my head. The longer I stayed there, the stronger the sensation became, a crawling awareness sliding across my thoughts, as if something was reading me slowly, carefully, deciding what I was. My hands trembled as I backed away, never lifting my gaze, every instinct screaming to run, and when I finally reached a safe distance, the pressure lifted so suddenly I nearly staggered. I didn't breathe properly until I was back on the path, heart hammering, sweat cooling on my neck despite the chill. I told myself I was overreacting, that stress and darkness were playing tricks on me, but the lie tasted weak even as I thought it. The rounds continued, each one heavier than the last, the cemetery growing quieter in a way that felt deliberate. Time began to behave strangely, minutes stretching thin, then collapsing in on themselves. At some point I realized I hadn't heard a single insect in a while. No crickets, no distant dogs, nothing. Just my own breathing and the soft crunch of gravel. When I checked my watch again, it was later than it should have been, edging closer to the hour I'd been dreading since reading the rules. My chest tightened as I remembered the warning about the structure at the far end of the grounds, the one surrounded by iron and shadow. I tried not to think about it, tried to focus on finishing the round, but the path curved in that direction on its own. Or maybe I drifted without realizing, pulled by something subtle and insistent. That was when I saw it. At first, it looked like a trick of shadow, a darker shape against the dark, standing unnaturally still near the old mausoleum. My steps slowed, my pulse roaring in my ears, and as my flashlight beam wavered, the shape resolved into the outline of a person. Not moving, not breathing, just standing there, facing the stone, as if in quiet contemplation. My mouth went dry. Rule 5. The words hit me like ice water. If you see a figure near the mausoleum, leave immediately. Do not approach, do not investigate. Every instinct in my body rebelled against that instruction. I wanted to know who it was, what they were doing, whether they were real. Curiosity surged, hot and sharp, pushing against the fear, whispering that this was my chance to understand, to prove I wasn't a coward. But beneath that urge was something colder, something older, a warning that didn't come from thought, but from bone. I backed away slowly, every nerve screaming, refusing to let my eyes leave the silhouette, even as my vision blurred at the edges. The figure didn't move. It didn't turn. It didn't react at all. That somehow made it worse. I turned and walked, then walked faster, then nearly ran, the gravel biting into my soles, my breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. I didn't stop until I was back inside the office, door locked, back pressed against it, heart slamming so hard it hurt. I checked the time with shaking hands. Too early, far too early. I had to stay inside until the hour passed. The office felt smaller now, the walls closer, the shadows thicker, curling in the corners like they were listening. I sat there trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself I was still in control, that I hadn't imagined the way the figure's presence lingered in my mind like an afterimage burned onto my thoughts. I told myself I was safe. I told myself this was just a job. I told myself I could quit in the morning. And somewhere, deep inside, a quieter voice whispered that it wasn't that simple anymore, that something had already taken note of me, that the rules weren't just about survival, they were about permission. When I finally stood to resume my rounds, my legs felt weak, my reflection in the office window pale and unfamiliar, eyes too bright, smile too tight. And as I stepped back into the cemetery, the darkness seemed to shift, almost eagerly, as if welcoming me back.
The moment I stepped back onto the path, something felt wrong in a way that went deeper than fear, deeper than instinct. Like the world itself had tilted a few degrees off balance and never bothered to correct itself. And I swear the darkness noticed me again the instant I returned, the air tightening as though I'd interrupted a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My footsteps sounded too loud. then too soft, then not quite synced with my movement, and for a horrible second I wondered if I was hearing myself at all. I kept going anyway, because stopping felt worse, because standing still felt like an invitation. The cemetery stretched on endlessly now, familiar paths subtly rearranged, headstones appearing where I didn't remember them being, shadows pooling where light should have reached. My watch ticked louder than it had any right to, each second landing heavy in my chest, and when I checked it again my stomach sank. It was almost 3. The number alone made my throat tighten. 3 o'clock. The rule surfaced instantly, uninvited, sharp as a needle behind my eyes. At 3, there would be crying near the east fence. Do not investigate. The words repeated themselves, rhythmic, insistent, like a chant meant to hold something back. I slowed my pace without realizing it, every nerve in my body stretching thin, listening. At first there was nothing, just the hush of air moving through dead leaves. Then, faintly, so faintly I almost convinced myself it was imagination, I heard it. A sound like breath breaking, like someone trying very hard not to sob and failing anyway. My chest tightened so suddenly it hurt. The sound carried weight, emotion, a rawness that sliced straight through logic. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was intimate, personal. The kind of crying that happens when someone thinks they're alone. Oh, my heart lurched in response before my brain could catch up, because that sound knew exactly how to reach into you, how to pull at the soft parts you don't like to admit are there. The crying drifted from the direction of the east fence, just like the rule said it would, growing clearer with every step I took without meaning to. I stopped abruptly, my foot hovering over the gravel, pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Don't investigate. The words flashed in my mind, but the crying changed then, turning shakier, more desperate, threaded with something like fear. It sounded young. It sounded tired. It sounded so real it hurt. My throat tightened and a lump formed I couldn't swallow down, because all I could think was how cruel it would be to ignore someone suffering like that, how wrong it felt to stand there listening while someone cried alone in the dark. My hands curled into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms, and for a moment I hated the rules, hated the stupid notebook, hated the faceless people who'd written them without any regard for how hard it would be to follow them. The crying wavered, broke, then came again, softer this time, almost hopeful, like it sensed it was being heard. My breath caught, my chest aching with the urge to help, to call out, to say something, anything. Just as my lips parted, a cold awareness slid through me, sharp and sudden, and with it came a terrible realization. The crying wasn't echoing through the cemetery, it was echoing inside my head. I froze, heart slamming so violently I thought it might tear free. The sound wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It surrounded me, wrapped around my thoughts, threaded through my breathing. My vision blurred at the edges as my body screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but my feet refused to obey. The crying shifted then, subtly, reshaping itself, and buried beneath the sobs I heard something else, something that made my blood turn cold. My name. Not shouted, not whispered, spoken softly, intimately, the way someone says your name when they're close enough to feel your breath. A shudder tore through me, and a broken laugh escaped my throat. Sharp and hysterical, because hearing your own name spoken by something you cannot see does something irreversible to your sense of safety. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head, whispering no, no, no under my breath, reminding myself of the rule, clinging to it like a lifeline. Do not investigate, do not respond. The crying swelled, growing louder, closer, layered now with whispers, fragments of words I almost understood, phrases that brushed against memory and grief and regret. It sounded like apologies, like promises, like someone remembering things they shouldn't. My knees trembled so badly I thought I might collapse, and for one horrible moment I considered letting myself fall, just to make it stop, just to make it end. That absence was worse than the sound itself. I stood there shaking, heart pounding, ears ringing, waiting for something else to happen, waiting for punishment, for consequence, for anything. Nothing came. Slowly, painfully, I realized I was still alive. I was still standing. I hadn't answered. I hadn't gone to the fence. A shaky laugh bubbled up from my chest, half relief, half disbelief, tears stinging my eyes as adrenaline drained out of me all at once. My legs nearly gave out as I forced myself to turn away and stumble back toward the path, each step heavy, my body buzzing like I'd brushed against a live wire. The rest of the round blurred together, time stretching and snapping in strange ways, moments slipping through my fingers. The cemetery felt different now, watchful in a new way, not hostile exactly, but aware, as if it had taken note of my hesitation, my weakness, my mercy. The silence returned, deeper than before, thick enough to press against my thoughts. When I checked my watch again, the hand seemed to lag, then jump forward, skipping seconds like a scratched record. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, my imagination running wild, but the lie tasted bitter. Somewhere, behind me, far off, I thought I heard movement. Not footsteps this time, but the soft brush of fabric, the quiet sound of something being dragged gently across stone. I didn't turn. I didn't slow down. I walked with my jaw clenched and my eyes fixed ahead, repeating the rules in my head like a prayer, even as doubt crept in, whispering that knowing the rules wasn't the same as understanding them, that following them didn't mean you were safe, only that you were being allowed to continue. By the time I reached the final stretch of my rounds, my nerves were shredded, my thoughts fraying at the edges. I told myself dawn was coming soon, that I just had to make it a little longer, just hold on, just survive until the light returned. That was when I saw him. At first, he looked like another statue, another shadow shaped by moonlight and tricked perception, standing near one of the older graves with his back to me. But something about him was wrong in a way I couldn't explain, a stiffness that didn't belong to living bodies. He wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed black hat, his posture rigid, hands clasped neatly behind him as if in polite contemplation. My stomach dropped. The rules surfaced instantly, sharp and cold. Avoid eye contact, nod politely, do not speak. Every muscle in my body screamed to stop, to turn, to run, but I forced myself forward, step by trembling step, heart hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. As I drew closer, I became aware of a pressure in the air, a heaviness that made each breath feel borrowed. The man didn't move, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge me at all. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and dipped my head in a small, stiff nod just like the rule said. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl, his head tilted a fraction in my direction. Not enough for me to see his face, but enough for me to feel his attention settle on me like a weight. My vision blurred, my pulse roared, and I fought the overwhelming urge to look, to see what was under that brim, to confirm what part of me already knew was waiting there. I kept my eyes forward, every nerve screaming, and walked past him, counting my steps, my breaths, my heartbeat, praying silently to anything that might still be listening. The moment I passed, the air seemed to release, pressure easing just enough for me to inhale properly again. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I didn't dare acknowledge the cold awareness lingering at my spine. When the first hint of dawn finally began to pale the sky, I was back in the office, shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor. My reflection in the dark window looked wrong somehow, eyes too bright, face drawn tight with something that wasn't just fear. I laughed softly, a broken, breathless sound, because part of me couldn't believe I was still there, still breathing, still myself. Another part wasn't so sure. The night had taken something from me, something small but essential, and left something else behind in its place. As light crept in, the cemetery shifted again, becoming almost ordinary, almost harmless, like it was pretending none of it had happened. When the door finally opened and Mr. Graydon stepped in with the morning air, his expression calm and knowing, I felt a strange rush of relief and resentment all at once. He looked at my face for a long moment, eyes narrowing just slightly, then nodded as if confirming a private thought. "You made it," he said quietly, handing me a cup of coffee. The warmth seeped into my hands, grounding me. Not everyone does. I wanted to ask him everything, about the crying, the man in the hat, the rules, what this place really was, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I just stared at the steam rising from it, my reflection wavering in it, and realized with a sinking certainty that the night wasn't finished with me yet. It had only just learned my name.
Sleep never came after that first night, not really, not the kind that rests you, only shallow drifting filled with half-dreams and jolting awakenings where my heart raced like I was still standing in the dark between graves. And by the time evening crept back in, I realized with a sinking heaviness that I wasn't relieved to be awake, I was dreading the return. All day the sounds of the night replayed themselves inside my head, the crying, my name spoken wrong, the weight of that man's attention pressing into my spine. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that no amount of money was worth the way my hands still shook when I tried to hold a cup. But when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across my apartment walls, something inside me shifted. It wasn't courage, it wasn't greed, it was familiarity. A strange pull, quiet and insistent, like a tide that had already decided where I belonged. I found myself getting dressed without fully choosing to, keys in my hand before I remembered picking them up, my reflection in the mirror looking both exhausted and oddly alert, eyes too sharp for someone who hadn't slept. When I arrived at the cemetery again, the gates opened with the same tired groan, but this time it sounded less like a warning and more like recognition. Mr. Graydon was there as always, waiting, posture unchanged, expression unreadable. He didn't ask if I was coming back. He simply nodded once, as if the decision had already been made long before I ever applied. He handed me the notebook again, and when our fingers brushed, a strange chill ran up my arm. "You did well," he said quietly, "better than most." There was something almost like pride in his voice, and beneath it something heavier, relief maybe, or guilt. I wanted to ask him what happened to the others, what this place really was, why the rules felt less like safety instructions and more like boundaries drawn around something breathing just out of sight. But he was already turning away, already done with the conversation, leaving me alone once more with the weight of the night settling in. The second night felt different from the first in ways I couldn't explain. The cemetery didn't feel like a place I was entering anymore. It felt like a place that was opening itself to me, slowly, cautiously, as if testing how much of me it could reveal without breaking me. The air hummed faintly, not with sound but with intention, and I became acutely aware of how my footsteps no longer echoed the same way they had before. The rules sat heavier in my pocket now, not because I feared breaking them, but because I understood, in some quiet, unsettling way, that they were watching to see how I followed them. The first rounds passed without incident, yet my nerves never settled. My thoughts kept drifting, looping back to the crying, to the man in the hat, to the feeling of being observed inside my own head. Somewhere deep down, a part of me whispered that this wasn't just a job anymore, it was a conversation, and the cemetery was waiting for my replies. As the night deepened, subtle changes crept in. The stones seemed closer together than before, paths bending where I didn't remember them bending, shadows pooling thicker at my feet. When I checked my watch, time hesitated, the second hand stuttering before lurching forward, and a quiet unease crawled up my spine. I laughed softly to myself, a hollow sound, trying to shake the tension, but the laugh echoed wrong, stretching longer than it should have, as if something else had taken it and played it back. I stopped walking. The echo stopped too. My chest tightened. I hadn't read a rule about echoes. That realization made my mouth go dry. I started moving again, slower now, listening, watching, feeling the place breathe around me. It was during the next round that I noticed the notebook felt heavier than before, not physically heavier, but fuller, as if it contained more than it had the night before.
When I flipped it open under the beam of my flashlight, my heart lurched. New lines had appeared beneath the old rules, written in the same uneven handwriting, the ink darker, fresher. My name was written there, unmistakably mine. Seeing it made my chest tighten so sharply I had to sit down. Below it were new instructions, short and unsettlingly specific, referencing things I hadn't told anyone, thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. My throat grew dry as I realized the rules weren't static. They were growing, learning, adapting. I laughed weakly, a breathy, disbelieving sound, because the alternative was panic, and panic felt too dangerous here. My hands shook as I closed the notebook, heart pounding with a realization I didn't want to accept. The cemetery wasn't just observing behavior, it was studying me.
The night pressed on, heavier than before, and when the hour crept close to 3 again, a deep unease settled in my gut. I found myself slowing near the eastern fence without meaning to, dread and anticipation twisting together until I couldn't tell them apart. The air grew colder, my breath fogging faintly, and a familiar pressure began to build behind my eyes. Then the crying returned, softer this time, closer, not desperate like before, but intimate, almost conversational, like someone speaking through tears to someone they trusted. My name slipped through the sound again, clearer now, wrapped in something that felt disturbingly like affection. My chest ached, my eyes burned. I felt myself leaning forward before I realized I was moving. The rules screamed in my head, but so did something else, a longing, a sense of recognition, as if whoever was crying knew me in a way no one else ever had. The sound shifted, reshaping itself into fragments of sentences, memories that didn't belong to me yet felt painfully familiar. I heard laughter that made my throat tighten, arguments that ended in silence, apologies whispered too late. Tears slid down my face before I could stop them, my breath hitching, my resolve cracking under the weight of emotions that weren't mine but felt like they were. I don't know how long I stood there shaking, torn between the rules and the pull of that voice, but something inside me finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet yielding. My foot slid forward an inch, then another. The ground felt colder, softer, like it was giving way slightly beneath my weight. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones. The crying softened, almost pleased, and then from somewhere deep and unseen, another sound emerged, a whisper layered beneath the first, older, heavier, carrying authority. It spoke my name slowly, carefully, like it was tasting it. Terror surged through me, sharp and electric, jolting me back into myself. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, breath coming in ragged gasps. And the moment I broke away, the sounds cut off all at once. Silence slammed down so hard it made my ears ring. I collapsed against a nearby headstone, shaking uncontrollably, tears spilling freely now, not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming sense that I had nearly crossed a line I couldn't uncross. When I finally steadied myself and looked around, the cemetery had changed again. The shadows lay flatter, less aggressive, as if disappointed. The air felt colder, but emptier too, like a room after an argument. My watch ticked forward normally now, mocking in its steadiness. I forced myself to stand, legs weak, and stumbled through the rest of the rounds in a daze, mind buzzing with fragments of voices and half-remembered emotions that didn't belong to me. By the time the sky began to lighten, I felt hollowed out, scraped raw from the inside. When Mr. Graydon appeared at dawn, his expression darkened the moment he saw my face. He studied me for a long time before speaking, his jaw tightening. "You heard them," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I tried to answer, but my voice came out broken, useless. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like a man carrying a weight he'd hoped to set down long ago. "They always start speaking sooner or later," he murmured. "The important thing is whether you listen." His eyes met mine, heavy with something like pity. "You came close tonight," He didn't say more, just handed me my pay and turned away, leaving me standing there with the morning light washing over the stones, feeling older than I had the night before. As I walked back to my car, exhaustion settling deep in my bones, a terrible thought crept in and refused to leave. The rules weren't meant to keep the dead contained. They were meant to teach the living how to coexist with them. And somehow, without realizing it, I was learning faster than I should have. By the third night, something inside me had quietly accepted that there was no real before anymore, no clean line between who I had been and whatever I was becoming, because denial only works when reality still asks permission, and this place never did. I arrived earlier than usual, not out of discipline, but because staying away felt worse, like holding my breath too long. The cemetery greeted me with a strange stillness, almost polite, as if pleased by my return, and I hated how familiar that feeling was. The notebook waited where it always did, but this time I didn't open it right away. I already knew there would be something new inside. I could feel it humming against my palm, warm in a way paper should never be. When I finally looked, my stomach twisted. There were more instructions now, written in steadier handwriting, more confident, less frantic. They weren't warnings anymore. They were expectations. Lines about when to listen and when to pretend not to hear, about which thoughts were safe to keep and which ones needed to be let go, about how memory, when left unattended, begins to rot. My name appeared again, more than once, woven naturally into the sentences, as if it had always belonged there. I laughed under my breath, a soft, broken sound that surprised even me, because somewhere deep down, I understood the joke. The rules were no longer being given to me. They were being written with me. The night unfolded slowly, thick and heavy, each minute stretching like it didn't want to pass. The air felt crowded, not with bodies, but with attention. Everywhere I moved, I felt observed, not aggressively, not hungrily, but with something closer to curiosity, even affection. It made my chest ache in a way I didn't have words for. The crying didn't start right away this time. Instead, there were whispers, overlapping fragments drifting through the dark like scraps of unfinished prayers. They spoke of names I didn't recognize but somehow understood, of small lives and smaller regrets, of promises made under pressure and kept long after they should have been forgiven. My eyes burned, my throat tightened, and I found myself whispering apologies to no one in particular because the silence felt judgmental when I didn't. At some point I realized I was responding aloud, nodding, murmuring reassurances, promising things I didn't remember agreeing to promise. And the cemetery listened. It always listened. When the crying finally came, it wasn't from the distance anymore. It was close enough that I could feel it vibrate through the ground, through my legs, through my ribs. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to run, to remember the rules. But another instinct, quieter, older, urged me to stay. The sound wasn't just sorrow now. It carried relief, like someone finally being heard after a very long time. My vision blurred, tears spilling freely, my chest aching with a grief that felt ancient and personal all at once. I whispered without meaning to, telling it I was here, that I was listening, that it didn't have to keep repeating itself. The moment the words left my mouth, the air shifted. The crying softened into something almost like a sigh. The pressure eased, and then, softly, gently, unmistakably, something answered me. Not from the ground, not from the dark, but from inside my own head. It spoke in my voice, using my tone, my rhythm, my pauses, and that realization cracked something open inside me. I staggered back, clutching at my chest, laughter bubbling up through tears because the horror of it was so absurd, so intimate, so perfectly cruel. Memories began slipping into place that weren't mine. Standing water reflecting lantern light, hands trembling over a surface that wouldn't stay still, a name whispered like a curse and a prayer at once. I tasted river water in my mouth and gagged, heart pounding, knees buckling as grief crashed over me in waves.
I saw fragments of lives stitched together by regret, by silence, by rules written too late. I understood then what this place really was, what it had always been. Not a prison, not a punishment, a vessel. A place where stories that refused to end were stored inside the living because the dead had nowhere else to go. The rules weren't barriers, they were stitching. They were how the damage was contained, how it was passed on gently, carefully, so the world outside could pretend nothing was wrong. I laughed again, weak and shaking, because of course that was the secret. Of course survival came at the cost of becoming something else. The final shift happened quietly. No thunder, no screams, no dramatic collapse. Just a moment where the fear loosened its grip and something steadier took hold. I felt aligned, tuned, like a radio finally hitting the right frequency. The whispers settled into a low, constant presence, no longer overwhelming, just there, waiting, trusting. When dawn approached, the sky paling at the edges, I realized I wasn't exhausted the way I had been before. I felt strangely full, grounded in a way I hadn't felt since long before my life fell apart. When Mr. Graydon arrived, he stopped short, his expression unreadable, eyes searching my face. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. His shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and sorrow so deep it hurt to look at. "It's done then," he said softly. I nodded. He exhaled slowly, like someone finally setting down a burden he'd carried too long. "You'll stay," he said, not as a question. I surprised myself by answering immediately. Yes. The word felt right, necessary. As the sun rose, washing the stones in pale gold, I understood something with aching clarity. This place didn't destroy people. It chose them. Not the strongest, not the bravest, but the ones already cracked open by loss. The ones who knew what it meant to carry grief without collapsing under it. The ones who could listen without turning away. Somewhere behind me, the whispers settled into a low, constant presence, no longer overwhelming, just there, waiting, trusting. And as I walked deeper into the grounds, notebook warm in my hand, new pages already waiting, one final thought brushed against my mind, gentle and certain and impossibly calm. The rules will continue, the stories will continue, and someday, when I'm gone, someone else will read my handwriting and wonder how it all began, never realizing that the moment they feel curious instead of afraid, the moment they lean in instead of stepping back, the work has already chosen them too.